been feeling down lately. He lost his job as a line cook, and he's not really sure what he wants to do next. He knows he should try to find another job. The economy's not that great, and he kind of feels like it's not worth it to try at this point. He's been sleeping later and later because he doesn't have that much to do. He tries going out with friends to make himself feel better, but they all have jobs, and he finds that that's kind of annoying to be around. And then they stop calling because he wasn't that nice to them when they hung out. He starts to feel kind of worthless and pointless, and things just really aren't going that well for Jim. So what's going on? Now, if you were Jim's therapist, what diagnosis would you come to? You might suspect that he's depressed because he mentions feeling sad. But feeling sad isn't enough on its own, because we all feel sad sometimes. It's natural. It's a natural part of life. But Jim also mentioned changes in his sleep and eating patterns. He mentioned lost interest in hanging out with his friends and feeling irritable. He also mentioned that he feels worthless because he hasn't found a job yet. It also seems that his depression is maybe preventing him from finding a new job. So all of this together with the sadness means that Jim is demonstrating most of the signs of major depression, which is a mood disorder that affects 8 to 12% of people at some point during their lives. Now, Jim does not have recurrent suicidal thoughts, and we'll talk more about suicide near the end of the lesson. But even so, since he has many of the other items of a depression diagnostic checklist, you might diagnose him as having a major depressive episode anyway. It's totally understandable that Jim would feel sad after losing his job. What makes Jim's experience major depression are his other symptoms and their duration of longer than 2 weeks. That's an important distinction for major depression. It has to last longer than 2 weeks. Now, major depressive episodes are often set off by traumatizing events, like the loss of a job or the death of a loved one, but it's a reaction that's beyond normal sadness or grief. So Jim feeling sad about his job, that would be totally normal, totally fine. It's that it goes on for so long and affects him in so many other ways. Now, susceptibility to major depression is believed to have some biological underpinnings, so Jim might be more likely to become depressed from losing his job than somebody else, due to maybe low levels of serotonin and norepinephrine. These are neurotransmitters, and low levels of them have been observed in patients who are depressed. There's also differences in actual brain structure. There's a structure called the basal ganglia, and also the thalamus and the hippocampus. These are all differently shaped in people who are depressed. Now, it's actually really interesting. It's been shown that if you actually increase levels of serotonin, which, if you remember, they were low in people who were depressed, if you make those levels go higher, it can stimulate growth in the hippocampus, which is one of the structures that was smaller. So it's possible that these things are related. Depression is associated with certain psychological traits as well. General low self-esteem, negative emotions, a tendency to blame yourself for bad things that happen. It's also been associated with social isolation. Now, it's not clear whether social isolation actually causes depression or depression causes social isolation. You remember that Jim's friends didn't really want to hang out with him much because he wasn't that friendly or nice when he was feeling depressed. Now let's talk about Sandra. Nothing out of the ordinary has happened to Sandra lately. She is still happily employed, but she's been unhappy for a long time and has symptoms similar to Jim's, but a little milder. Now, if you were Sandra's therapist, you might diagnose dysthymic disorder. And this is a milder, more long-lasting form of depression. So if she's been experiencing depressive symptoms for over 2 years, but at a sort of a milder level than someone like Jim, you might diagnose her with dysthymic disorder. And it's treated basically the same as depression, but it's just a lower grade and longer lasting form of it. Now, if we imagine mood, and these are mood disorders, let's remember, if we imagine mood as a spectrum, depression and dysthymia both make people sort of hang out for longer in the depressive end. Bipolar disorder is just what it sounds like. It makes people hang out at both ends or poles of this mood spectrum, the depressive end and the sort of manic, high energy end. Now, they have episodes similar to those in major depressive disorder. the low affect, feeling bad about yourself, all of that stuff, followed by periods of what's known as mania. Mania is characterized by a feeling of basically being high, decreased need for sleep, inflated self-esteem, fast speech, agitation. Some extremely manic episodes can even have some psychotic symptoms like delusions or hallucinations. This is pretty uncommon, but it can happen in really extreme cases. And there are actually 3 kinds of bipolar disorders, and they vary in severity. So if you're hanging out at the extreme poles, that's bipolar 1. Now if you're hanging out a little bit toward the middle, but you're still cycling back and forth between depressive and manic, that's bipolar 2. The least extreme, so sort of hanging out near the middle of the spectrum, is known as cyclothymia. Now you note the thymia, we've heard that before in dysthymia. It basically just means mood or state of mind. So these two, dysthymia and cyclothymia, are basically mild forms of acute mood disorders. They're mild forms of depression and bipolar disorder. Now I said before that I'd come back to suicide. This is because it's actually more commonly associated with bipolar disorder than with depression. This may seem a little surprising, but it's actually because people who are depressed, though they may feel hopeless, they may feel like the world isn't going their way, they actually often don't have enough energy to make themselves actually go ahead and commit suicide. It's too much effort. But people who are bipolar, they have both sides. They have this depressed side that makes them feel really bad, and then they also have this manic side that gives them a ton of energy. So what often happens is that people who are bipolar will cycle from the one end of the spectrum, where they're really depressed, to the manic side, and then actually get enough energy to act out their suicide that they maybe planned but didn't have enough energy to do when they were depressed. So we've talked about the major mood disorders: depression and its milder cousin dysthymia, and the bipolar disorders, including their milder cousin cyclothymia. These can all be thought of existing on a spectrum from basically depressed to manic, and sort of hanging out at various places depending on what disorder it is. And they're distinguished from each other additionally by sort of length of time of the symptoms. And suicide is something that people with these conditions are at more risk for, although it's actually more common in bipolar disorder than it is in depression.